Chapter 17. The doctors at the small regional hospital were kept busy. 2 ambulances brought in 4 patients for treatment, all from the same house. Francis H. Willis was treated for a stab wound in his side, severe concussion, and a partially collapsed lung. Dorothy S. Willis was treated for blood poisoning. Henry P. York was treated for burns to the jaw, slight skull fracture, and resulting concussion. Richard Hutchins was treated for a compound wrist fracture. Penelope, Henrietta, and Anastasia Willis were all questioned individually, as was Ezekiel Johnson. They all told the same story, and the deputy who interviewed them retold it himself in the following weeks. It was always appreciated. Frank Willis slipped at the top of the stairs while carrying a knife and took a visiting English cousin with him. He stabbed himself, but luckily he only broke the boy's arm. Everybody in the house ran to the commotion, including Dotty, who had been frying bacon. She took the skillet with her, and when she saw the knife in old Frank's side, she fainted straight off. Henry, another cousin, tried to catch her, but only took grease to the face and a doorknob to the back of the head for his trouble. Still, it was a good thing for Dotty that she did faint, or they might not have caught the blood poisoning. Frank was the last to be released from the regional hospital. Dotty picked him up in the truck and drove him slowly through the field roads toward Henry, Kansas. They entered the city limits as quietly as the truck would allow and rolled past the burnt-out bus station and the old baseball field on their way to the tall house on the edge of town. That night, wind brought in black clouds, and the rain came down sideways. Zeke came to dinner wet. Penelope had told him everything, and the family sat down around 3 loaves of meat. At the end of the meal, Dotty arched her eyebrows at Frank. He nodded and set down his fork. "Well," he said, looking round the table, "this is the official meeting. We've all been through an adventure now, and here's where it ends. No more looking in cupboards, no more going through cupboards." "But I never got to go through one," Anastasia said. "Not even once." Frank smiled. "I know, and that's the way it's going to stay." He looked at Penelope. "Penny, you get your own room now. Your mother and I are moving into Grandfather's room." The kids all looked down at their plates, and Dotty blushed. "Frank," she said, "no one seems able to remember how, but during all the ruckus, the door shut again." "Grandfather's door?" Frank asked. "Locked." Dotty smiled. "Yeah." "Henrietta's got the key," Henry said. He sat up straight and looked at her. "I did," Henrietta said, "but that was a long time ago. Has anyone seen it?" Anastasia leaned over the table. "And she's keeping a baby rhino in the barn." Henrietta sighed. Everyone was looking at her. "It's not a rhino. It looks a little like one, but it's way smaller." "And it has wings," Anastasia said. "I followed her out there yesterday. She's feeding it cat food." Zeke looked at Henrietta. "Is that what you were carrying?" She nodded. "Well," Frank said, "we're all here. Go get the rhino." Henrietta came back into the dining room, dripping with rain. Her arms were wrapped around something fat and gray with black, beady little eyes. She set it on the table and sat down. It stood up on all 4s, shook out gray feathered wings, and looked around the table. It was shaped almost exactly like a rhinoceros, only it was 18 inches long and winged. It had one short, blunt horn, split and cracked at the end. Its belly hung almost to the ground like a basset hound's. "I haven't named him yet," Henrietta said, "and I can't get him to fly." "I hope you don't think you're keeping it," Dotty said. Frank was leaning forward, trying to look the thing in the eyes. He was smiling. "You aren't looking for me, are you?" he asked it. "What is it?" Zeke asked. Frank sat back up. "It's a ragant." Dotty looked at him. "What?" "A ragant. I've only seen 2 before. In some places I used to be, they're sent to find people. They can only be used once. When they found someone, they stay till they die." He looked up at Henrietta. "Where did you get him?" "He was in the cupboard with the compass locks. He'd been banging on the inside and broke his horn. He was almost dead and could barely move when I got him out." Henry laughed and leaned forward. "You cracked my plaster, didn't you? You started the whole thing." The ragant looked into Henry's eyes and snorted. He stepped toward him, lifted one of his front legs, and leaned, pointing until his horn almost touched Henry's face. "Ha!" Frank said. "It's Henry's." "What?" Henrietta said. "He's mine. I found him and fed him and took care of him." "We are not keeping it," Dotty said. Frank grinned. "Henry is." The Ragan turned and backed toward Henry, sat upright in front of him, tucked his wings back, and stared into space. "Someone is looking for you, Henry," Frank said. Henry felt a nervous bubble up inside of him. "Oh, don't worry," Frank added. "Ragans have never been used for any wickedness as far as I know." "This isn't fair," Henrietta said. "I've never had a pet." "You have Blake," Anastasia said, and she looked under the table where the cat slept. "Blake?" Henrietta said. "Blake's just another cat." Zeke started laughing. Henrietta glared at him, but he didn't stop. She didn't say anything else. "Frank," Dotty said, "we're not quite done." "Right," Frank said. "I'll be plastering over all the cupboards this weekend, and if I hear any late-night chipping, people are moving into the barn. And if anyone finds the key to Grandfather's room, they'll immediately, and without any sort of complaining, turn it in to the den mother." "That's me," Dotty said, in case anyone was confused. When everyone had pushed back from empty plates, Dotty told the girls to clear the table. Zeke got up to help. Richard decided to watch and followed Anastasia into the kitchen. She made faces all the way. Frank stood slowly, put his hand on Henry's shoulder, and led him toward the front porch. The Ragans walked proudly behind them. The rain had stopped, but the world was still dark and wet. The wind was warm. Frank eased himself into a rickety wicker chair and tucked a toothpick into his lip. Henry sat down on the top step and looked around for the Ragant. It was perched on the porch rail with its nose toward the clouds and its wings spread in the breeze. "Did it just fly, Uncle Frank?" Henry asked. "Did you see it?" "Sure it did, but I didn't see anything. Ragans are proud, especially when they finish a job, so they don't like people to see them fly. Not sure why, probably think it looks undignified." The strange creature was really there. Henry could have reached out and touched it, but his mind still couldn't make sense of the animal. "Why would anyone be looking for me?" he asked. "Well," Frank said, "because they lost you." Henry stared at him. Frank pulled out his toothpick and examined the end. "I told you, Phil and Urs aren't your parents, Henry." "I thought I was adopted." "Yeah," Frank said, "but, well, it wasn't a normal sort of adoption." Henry waited for him to continue. Frank looked at him. "Your grandfather always said he'd found you on the porch, but he was never Mr. Truth." "I saw something in Grandfather's journal," Henry said. "Something about me coming through the cupboards." Frank leaned back in his chair. "Do you think that could be true?" Henry asked. "Do you think I came from a different place?" "In my experience," Frank said slowly, "when your grandfather found things, they were usually from the attic." Frank pointed his toothpick at the Ragant. "Not many pets like that around here, for one." Henry looked at the animal. Its blunted nose was still up, but it had shut its eyes. Frank cleared his throat. "Dots and I wanted you, Henry, but Phil and Urs got the adoption. I've always felt guilty about it. Wished I could have changed things." Henry looked at his uncle and at the clouds rolling above them. He looked at the Ragant. The wind smelled like Badon Hill. "I'm not from here," he said. "You and me both," Frank said. "But here's where we're from now." The two of them sat silently and watched the world blow, and when the wind died and the darkness grew thick, they listened to the Ragant breathe and to the laughter from the kitchen. That night Henry lay on his bed and felt his sore head and the newborn scar tissue along his jaw. He was looking at the 99 doors on his wall and thinking about the one downstairs. He had already made sure the bed was against the black cupboard, and he felt better having the Ragant around anyway. It was snoring by his feet. He rolled onto his side, facing away from the wall, and reached to turn off his lamp. When he did, he blinked. A beam of yellow light stood out through his room. He sat up and looked at the mailbox. There was another envelope inside. He looked at the door for a moment, then began hunting for the key. He found it underneath his socks. When the door was open, he pulled out the letter, then crouched and stared at the yellow room for a while, hoping for a glimpse of the pants. They never came. Finally, he shut the little door and sat up. He looked over his wall. The Ragan flared a wing out in its sleep and pawed at the blankets. "I'm from one of those," he told the animal. "But you know that, don't you? You probably know which one." Henry shifted to his knees and reached for the door to Baden Hill. Frank had said no more cupboards, but he knew his uncle would understand. He pulled the door open and sat back, just to smell the air and listen to the trees. Something fluttered out of the darkness and landed on his bed. Henry picked it up. It was another letter, folded and sealed with the green man. 2 letters now. He shut the cupboard and looked at the 2 of them next to each other. They looked exactly like the first ones. "I don't want these," he said out loud. "I'm done now." He opened the long one first, and his eyes struggled with the writing. "Sir, I take up this quill to impress the magnification of our order. Your hands bear praise, for they freed the last Endorian blood. The old daughter of the second sire regains her earth strength. We kindle her call. Gratitation and frati, Darius, first among the last-born magi, witch-dog of Byzantium." Henry dropped the letter like it would stain his fingers and kicked it off his bed. It was still gibberish, but he understood it now. He had seen the witch-dogs work, or seen some spectral haunted dream of their working, and he wanted none of their gratitation, none of their anything. He touched the green seal on the other letter, and when it popped, he unfolded the parchment. The same typed lines looked up at him. "Issuance from the Central Committee of Farron for the Prevention of Mishap, District RRK. Composed and authorized by Committee Chair under Executive Guidelines, BFX VII. Delivered via the Island of Baden Chapter, District AP. To whom we have concerned, it is the finding of the committee that whimpering child, hereafter WC, has aided, abetted, and enabled the unearthing and potential reestablishment of old evil and is a danger to the Farron people himself and the tapestry of reality. WC shall henceforth be identified as enemy, hazard, and human mishap to all Farron in all districts, all worlds, and all ways. Identification has been distributed, and status change documented. Where and when WC is encountered, the committee has authorized, yea, demanded, that he be hampered, hindered, detained, damaged, or destroyed. Such treatment performed by any Farron of any district, way, or world shall be deemed just, necessary, merciful, and inevitable. Ralph Radolph, Chair, CCFPM, District RRK. C&A by CC under EG per BFXVII, delivered via Island Hill of Baden Chapter, District AP. Henry flopped back onto his bed and stared at the poster on his ceiling. Then he kicked his wall. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't wanted to free a witch. He actually had very little to do with it. Well, he had chipped the plaster off his wall and uncovered the cupboards. There was that. But that hadn't even been his fault. He propped himself up. "That was you," he said to the Ragan, and poked it with his toe. "You had to start thumping in there." The Ragan's skin quaked like a horse shaking off a fly, and it sat up. Its black eyes stared at Henry, and then it yawned and walked onto Henry's legs. Henry flopped back again, and the Ragan crawled onto his chest and curled up into a wheezing ball. Henry smiled. "Your fault," he said again. "I did nothing. I'm just scenery." Downstairs, Dottie opened her eyes. "Frank?" Frank grunted. She sat up and reached for her bathrobe. "Henry York, you better not be doing what I think you're doing." Frank's hand pulled her back down. "He'll be fine," he said. Epilogue. The cat was large, used to feeding on the rubbish and scrapings thrown out kitchen window, and occasionally on also overfed and lazy rats. He was a tom, black with a white face and tail. He had no name that he knew of, but someone was calling for him. That someone wanted him, needed him. He did not usually venture up into the room where the old man sat, the room with the gaping doors and the moon windows. The doors made his spine tingle and his pads cold. But this time he leaped up the stairs with his belly swinging below him. He passed the cold body of a young wizard sprawled at the top, and then two others, and between them the body of a dog. Once he was in the throne room, the calling thrilled him, filling his mind and all his senses. And there, standing inside one of the thickly curtained doorways and facing a young man, and orderly still on his feet, was a woman. To the cat's mind she was both old and young, weak and strong, all-seeing but in need of his wisdom, his sight. He leapt into the woman's arms, and she was inside him. His mind was with hers, and then, in a moment, his was gone. "What's your name?" the woman asked the man. The young man did not look away from her. "Monmouth," he said. "What is yours?" The woman laughed, filling the stone hall with her echoes. "You are not even an apprenticed wizard, and you ask me this? I have fed myself on the lives of your masters who lie cold behind you, and you stand to request my name?" She stepped toward him. "I do," he said, and he did not so much as shift his feet. She stepped even closer, stroked the heavy cat's head. "Then wake your doddering master, Carnassus, and tell him this, if your mouth will hold the words. Nemean, dread queen of Endor, last in Neac's line, whose voice destroyed the magic of Fitzferren, boiled up the sea to shatter the strength of Amram, and laid Merlinus to rest beneath the wood, once bound by Mordecai, Amram's son, has shaken off her chains as her fathers shook off the blood of Adam, and comes to see if an old man remembers vows he made when he was young. New prey waits on the witch dogs."